Hi, I'm here to talk to you about AWS Amplify today. AWS Amplify is a set of tools and services that enables mobile and front-end web developers to build secure, scalable, full-stack applications, all powered by AWS. My name is Gerard Sanz, and I'm a developer advocate for Amplify. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a REST API using Amplify to manage a to-do app and consume it from a web app using Vue. We will integrate our REST API with Amazon DynamoDB to store our data and allow access both to authorized and guest users. Before we start this tutorial, let me show you the Getting Started for Vue. So we can see the different pieces that make Amplify framework. We have the Amplify CLI, the Amplify libraries, and the Amplify UI components. And before we start, I would like you to follow the prerequisites. So just to make sure you have the latest versions of Node, NPM, and Git. And also, if you haven't got an AWS account, this is the right time to go ahead and create one. You can follow the instructions in this video, or you can follow the manual instructions that appear here, just below. Before we do that, let's go and see a demo of what we are going to build. So what we can see here is our login screen, and we are going to restrict access to both registered users and also guest users. So we need to log in order to use our REST API. So let me log in. And what we can see here is a message welcoming the user. In this case, the username is gsanz with hey gsanz. And also we will be able to sign out so other users can also use these features. Below we can see all of the different methods that our API will be using. So we have get to dos, which will be our endpoint. Then we have get to dos by ID. We can also create new to dos by using post to dos and update to dos by using put. Finally, we have delete that will take the ID in order to remove any of the existing to-dos. So the way I build this is just to demonstrate the usage. There's no actual client, just to focus on the API. So if we look at the post to-dos, that will create a new to-do with some default values, and we will get back the ID for this new to-do. So we can then use it to call the other methods. So this is pretty much it. If I run delete, it will just go back to the initial state, and we can repeat that and see the different behaviors. So let's go ahead and create this app. First thing we want to do is run the Vue CLI to create our app. So let's pick Vue 2. And now we are going to make sure that it's all working. Okay. So the next command is amplify init. And we can pick a name for our environment. I'm going to use Vue Dep. You should have all these settings if you have followed the Getting Started guide that I mentioned before. And the first thing we are going to do is add the REST API. So I'm going to pick REST. For names, you can use the default or you can also write your own. I'm going to use Todo's API. And that's going to be our endpoint. So we are going to create a new Lambda function. We're going to call it Todo's Lambda. And I'm going to use the CRUD function for DynamoDB template. We're going to create a new table that's going to be called Todo's table. So I'm going to pick ID as the partition key, and I'm going to add some sensible attributes like text for the to-do, description, and complete. So I'm going to pick Boolean, and that's going to be it. So next, I'm going to pick the ID. That's going to be our partition key. There's not going to be sort key for this example, and also no global secondary indexes. We can also pick no trigger and no resources other in this project. We can also use that option to use resources that we created previously. We are not using a function, a scheduled, and we are also not using Lambda layers. So let's just edit this Lambda function. I'm just gonna let it open. And we are gonna restrict access for authenticated users and guests. So we can showcase how you can change that access for different users. So we are gonna accept both authenticated and guest users. And that's pretty much it. So we are done now with our setup, and we can go ahead and run Amplify Push. So all of the resources that we have created adding this REST API can be provisioned and created also in the backend. So we can see here an overview. We have a storage, we have a function, we also have authentication and the API. So once it's done, we can see our REST API endpoint. Let's give it a try. So what I'm going to do next is try to access the endpoint that we just created. So you can use that link there. And I'm going to use the cool command. And I'm going to add the to-dos, which is our endpoint. What we get here is a missing authentication token, which is expected. So we will have to build a client and also authenticate the user before using our API. So this is the template that we have picked. You can see the path. It's on our Amplify folder under backend functions. One thing to note here is that we can modify this. We can add dependencies. This is our entry point. So it's using Express, serverless Express. And that's going to take our app and launch it. So let's look at the code. At this point, we are not going to change it. And just to show you the dependencies for this template. So this is the full configuration for this template with DynamoDB. All right, so let's add the dependencies to create our client using Vue. So we are going to use AWS Amplify and AWS Amplify UI Vue. These are the UI components for Vue. And the first thing I'm going to do is add the configuration. So this is the configuration for Amplify, taking into account our AWS account that you should have set up previously. And I'm going to do some changes just to get an initial version that we can see. I will add also some styles just to make it a little bit nicer. So this is a header. And I'm also going to use the Amplify authenticator just to show a welcome message. In order to do that, I'm going to add a user in our state. And I'm going to be using that on auth UI state change that is listening to changes in our authentication. And by using that, I can see if the user has logged in. The next thing I'm going to do is add a form with an initial call to get to-dos. So that will be our test for get to-dos. And we need to add the API import using AWS Amplify, and also we'll add a method get to-dos. So this is our initial version. What we are going to do next is make the call to our API, so we can just use the get method. We name the API to-dos API, and we can use that as the first argument. As a second argument, I'm going to use the endpoint, which is /to-dos. And as a third argument, I can pass some other data that we are not going to use at this point. This returns a promise, and I can take the results, and I'm just going to output the result so we can see it in the console. And I'm also going to add a catch if you want to add error management. So I'm going to console log that error. And that will be our first method. So if I log in using my user, I can see that there's a new button there for the get to-dos. So let's add the other methods. I'm going to add one for a get to-do, passing the ID. I'm going to also create using add to-do, and also put and delete with update to-do and delete to-do. So let's get these methods created and focus on the changes that we are going to be doing in the get to do. So I'm going to use that to create the add to do method, and just going to use that to change the code in there. So instead of using the get, I'm going to use the post. We can also use put or patch, but for this method, I'm going to use post and just use the same skeleton that I've used before. One thing that I can use now as the third argument is I can change the body of this post, and I'm going to pass the description for my to-do. Let's see the changes that we need on our template. So this is the same template. I've changed some of the code, but most of it is the same. So here we can see that we are configuring our region and getting the right table name, taking into account the current environment. This will be important when we are using different environments like development and test. We're also adding the course, headers, and this is pretty much part of the template. So here we can see all the methods. This is the method to get the list of to-dos. I'm using a limit of 100 items, and I'm using the DynamoDB scan call. So this is part of the document client of DynamoDB, and I'm just getting a JSON response with the status code depending on a successful call or an error. So I'm going to do the same for getting a to-do by ID. And in this case, we are using the key. That's going to be our partition key, and I can get that from the request params. So that will be that colon ID, so I can access that ID in that way. Here, the operation in DynamoDB is a get, and we are using the same approach. Let's look at how we are adding a new to-do. So here we are adding a new item, and we are using the request body and adding some new attributes. So we are generating a new ID and creating the to-dos as not complete. And besides that, we are adding a timestamp. Let's look at how we are generating the ID. So in order to do that, we need to add a new import, a new dependency, and let me show you how we can add it. So we just opening the terminal at the source, and we can just go ahead and install that universal UID. So that will be now packaged with our Lambda, and we can see that we have the new dependency. So that is going to help us create these new IDs for new to-dos. So the last bit that we need to cover is how we get the user ID. And that's going to come from the request identity context. And we are going to create a small utility function to get that. So we can see that we get that information from the auth provider, and either we get that information or return an authenticated user. On Dynamo, we are using the put operation, and that will add a new record or update if there is an existing one. So let's look at the next entry. That will be for an update. An update is a little bit more complex to run in DynamoDB, but we can see that it follows most of the structure that we used before. There's also an expression, and we are going to build that expression depending on the fields that are coming from the request body, like the text, and if the to-do is complete or not. And we are going to be adding this conditionally. That will build the params. You can check more details on the documentation for DynamoDB, and the operation is going to be update. Last, we have the delete operation, and it's going to be similar to what we used before for get by ID, but now we are using the delete operation on DynamoDB. So that's pretty much all of the operations that we wanted to use. So now we are ready to push the changes to the backend. So let's run Amplify Push. to get the latest version of our to-dos Lambda, so we can start testing it. Okay, so let's see the UI. We have all these different options. And we can see what's the output. So far we are getting no results from the get to-dos. And if we run the add to-do, we get the new to-do as the body of the response. And we also can see that we get the user ID. So let's see how we can get that user ID from the session. So I'm going to refresh quickly. And before, we just add the Cognito user to our code, and we can see that that matches the user ID. So this is the user ID that comes from Cognito. So everything is working as expected. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the different resources. So the first one is the API gateway. And this is where we created the to-do API. And we can see the different resources that Amplify created for us. So we can see all of the methods. We are covering the endpoint to-dos and also any child routes. So let's navigate to this any, and we can see that we have access to a test. We can go ahead and test our get method. And it's a pretty easy way to test this from the console. We can also see the result and some other information like the response headers and also the logs. If we look here, we can see that we are using AWS IAM authorization, and Amplify created two roles for authorized users and for guests. So let's see some details for these roles. So here we can see the policies for the authorized users, and we can see that we have permissions to use all of the different methods: post, get, put, patch, and delete. So this would be any of the authorized users. Then for our guests, we can see that the policy actually, it only gives us access to the get method. So that's as we were expecting. We can also see the permissions. This is the to-dos Lambda. We can see an overview of all the resources, and this is how you can access to it. So that will open this screen. We can see the link between API gateway with our Lambda, and this is all of the information that we have assigned. One thing that will be very useful is the logs. So you can see here we have some rights to access the different logs and to write and read the logs. We can also see the different metrics of our usage. But the most interesting when building our API will be to see the result of these logs. So we can add traces and see the results over here. So you can see that it's pretty detailed thanks to CloudWatch. If we look at DynamoDB, we can see that a new table was created, and we can see that there's a new item for the to-do that we created. This is very much like a JSON object, and we can see the user ID, we can also see the timestamp and the other details. Another thing that we can access from the DynamoDB console is the capacity. This is how much we allocate for reads and writes, the indexes, and also other things like triggers. So if we go back to the code, we are going to do one thing, which is we are going to keep the ID, and we are going to keep it as last to do ID. And I'm going to use that so I know if I created a to-do, and then I can use that ID to run the other operations. So for example, for get to do, passing the ID, I can now pass this to the endpoint and get the results. And I'm going to do the same for update. It's the same technique. I'm going to use that last ID, and then here I'm changing and passing that as the last argument. So this is an update. And then for the delete, I'm going to use that last to-dos ID, and I'm going to pass it. See that I'm changing the API call, and also I'm resetting that value if I'm removing it. So that will allow us to do all of the operations with our to-dos. Here we can see the UI. Now I also have changed the visualization for the disabled buttons. You can see that we can create new to-dos. That's going to be now with complete false with to-do 1. If I go and now run the update, it should change that using the properties that we passed through the body. So that's using the ID and to-do and also completing the to-do. So we can see that here. We can also see that in the details. So now the task is completed, and I've changed also the description. We can also see that the update was being updated and is different from the creation. And that's pretty much it. We can also test the get to-dos by ID, and we can see that the URL includes the ID. That's going to give us the to-do that we created. And if we go ahead and remove it, we are going to just delete that to-do, and then we get the disabled buttons. So that's pretty much it. That's the end of the demo. You also have a copy of the solution at GSAN's Amplify REST to-dos UI view. So in this tutorial, we have seen how to create a REST API using Amplify to manage a to-dos app and consume it from a web app using Vue. We also integrated the REST API with Amazon DynamoDB to store our data and allow access both to authorized and guest users. Thanks for listening.